Hi everybody, I'm Greg Fishel and welcome to bonus weather video number 1 for this week. I'm actually recording this on May 29th, Monday, basically as a time saver for me tomorrow. Just got a lot of things going on, including a concert by Festive Brass at Myrtle Beach Tuesday night at the Convention Center. And so I thought it would be helpful for me to get this out of the road. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but just, try to budget my time so that tomorrow's not quite so hectic. So anyway, we're going to talk about the hurricane season that is upon us now, and we're going to talk about some products and some definitions, and also a little bit of advice from me on how to use and how not to use the products coming out from the Hurricane Center. All right, so let's start off with a few definitions. First of all, a tropical wave is basically just a trough or a wind shift line in the trade wind easterlies. Now, in the mid-latitudes where we live, we have prevailing westerlies, okay? But you go down far enough south, especially in the summertime, and everything moves from east to west, okay? And you probably notice this with tropical systems where they move east to west, and then they start to recurve, and then once they get far enough north, then they go back toward the east. And so when I say a wind shift line, it's almost like a cold front. You know how when cold fronts pass, the winds are southwest ahead of it maybe and northwest behind it? Same thing here. The only difference is that it's moving from east to west instead of west to east. Now, a tropical cyclone basically encompasses everything from a tropical depression to a major hurricane, okay? It's simply a warm core system, and we've talked about this on earlier bonus weather videos where tropical systems have all the warmest air right in the middle of it, okay? Right, like in a hurricane, in the sense of where the eye is. And then a mid-latitude system, the coldest air is usually to the west of the system. So they get their energy in completely different ways. So a warm core system with organized deep convection or thunderstorms and a closed circulation. So the winds are going around in a complete circle. It's not just a wind shift, but a complete circular pattern. All right, so a tropical depression is a tropical cyclone with maximum sustained winds of 38 miles per hour or less. A tropical storm has maximum sustained winds of anywhere from 39 to 73 miles per hour. A hurricane is a tropical cyclone with maximum sustained winds of 74 miles per hour or greater, and a major hurricane is defined as one that is either a Category 3, 4, or 5. Now, you might wonder, well, what's the definition of the different categories? I'm glad you asked that question. So for years, we've been using something called the Saffir-Simpson wind scale. A couple of guys that worked on this years and years ago. So a Category 1 is 74 to 95 miles an hour sustained winds. There will probably be power outages, some roof damage to homes, shallow-rooted trees coming down, and that type of thing. Category 2, the max sustained winds are 96 to 110, major roof and siding damage, trees down, near total power loss. That's with a Cat 2. Now, we get into the major categories now. Category 3, the max sustained winds are 111 to 129. Major damage to homes possible, trees blocking roads, electricity and water may not be available for several days. Category 4, max sustained winds of 130 to 156. Catastrophic damage to homes, power outages may last weeks or even months. And finally, a Category 5, max sustained winds of 157 miles per hour or higher, homes destroyed, much of the area uninhabitable for weeks or perhaps even months. So luckily, we don't get that many of those, but we do get them, and we've certainly seen the effects of them. Now, there's also the storm surge. Hurricanes are not at all about wind. A storm surge is defined as an abnormal rise in the sea level accompanying a tropical cyclone. Now, it's usually defined as the difference between what the regular tide would be and what the actual observed tide will be, or is. And this can vary a lot along coastal areas because it has to do with the ocean floor, how much it slopes, how the coastline is shaped. All those things go into determining how bad the storm surge is going to be. So you can't just say, oh, it's 110 miles an hour, it's going to be this everywhere. Can't do that, okay? A lot of variables, and the folks down at the National Hurricane Center are truly experts at being able to differentiate different parts of the coastline and what they're likely to observe. Now, almost half of hurricane-related deaths are due to storm surge, and almost half of the deaths is caused by inland flooding, We saw that a lot with Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina back in 1999. So what's interesting here is that the intensity scale is based on wind speeds, but 90% of the lives lost are due to water, either storm surge or flooding. Now, let's talk about watches and warnings. The National Hurricane Center issues advisories every 6 hours, except every 3 hours when coastal watches and/or warnings are in effect for any given area. A hurricane watch means hurricane conditions are possible within the watch area, and watches are issued when tropical storm force winds are possible within 48 hours, okay? Now, a hurricane warning means hurricane conditions are actually expected within the warning area, and warnings are issued when tropical storm force winds are expected within 36. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, it's a hurricane warning, why are we talking about tropical storm force winds? Well, because once tropical storm force winds are observed, it's very, very difficult to take any action to protect your life or property at that point. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, if things haven't changed, the ferries along the Outer Banks of North Carolina stop running when the winds get to gale force or tropical storm force. So if you ain't off the Outer Banks by that time, you ain't getting off, and so that's why they issue the hurricane warning based on the timing of tropical storm force winds, because at that point, any preparation is pretty much over. Okay, let's talk about the infamous cone of uncertainty or forecast fan or whatever you want to call it. And I think this is the most misused product that the Hurricane Center puts out. It's not their fault. Actually, to be honest with you, it's the fault of a lot of the media by focusing on the wrong thing. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So what the Hurricane Center does is they verify every forecast they make. And so they take the last 5 years, average out all the errors, and then that determines how big the forecast fan is. So these are the numbers being used for 2023 based on the average errors during the 2018 to 2022 hurricane seasons. At 12 hours, it's 30 miles, 24 hours, 45, up to 77 by 48 hours, 114 miles by 72, 167 by 96, and by 120 hours, the average error is 236 miles, okay? And that could be either east or west, okay? Now, what they do, and let me take myself out of the picture here so you can see this. There we go. So what they do is they take all of those circles that have radii of those distances, okay? So the circles get bigger out in time as the average error gets larger out in time. And then, oh, wait a minute. I gotta hit my cursor here. There we go. So these correspond to the forecast times of 12, 24, 36, all the way out to 120. And then they basically draw a line that covers the range of all of those different circles. And that's how the forecast fan is arrived at. Now, you'll notice that the time intervals here are only 12 hours, then they jump to 24. So these circles will be farther apart, but my screen wasn't big enough to show that. Okay, so here's what not to do. Let's say we're looking at a 72-hour forecast, and I think the average error was 114 miles. And here's the actual forecast track going right through the middle of that circle. And it could go 114 miles either to the northwest or to the southeast. And that's how wide the fan would be at that particular point in time. The red line, or the forecast track, is where the storm more than likely won't be. Okay, if you look at this graphic and that arrow, that forecast track, is aimed right at you, that's actually good news for you, because the average error is 114 miles. That more or less tells you where it ain't going to be. Okay, pardon my bad grammar through all this. I'm just doing it for effect. So that's really, I think the line ought to be outlawed. If you're in the fan, you're fair game. Okay, and the line, again, especially the farther you go out in time, is telling you where it's not going to be. And so why use it? Okay, now, a hurricane, as you probably heard many times, is not a point. So let's say that the hurricane is located here. It ends up being on the eastern edge of the fan, okay? Now, we've already talked about the fact that hurricanes are not a point. Hurricane Katrina, at its maximum intensity, had hurricane force winds that extended out almost 100 miles in most directions from the center. And so you can see here that the influence of a hurricane like Katrina would extend well beyond where the fan is if it ends up on the eastern part of that fan, okay? So if you just look at the fan and say, oh, I'm just outside of it, I'm okay. No, you're not, not necessarily, because of the fact that the winds extend far out from the center. And finally, the eye of the hurricane only ends up in the cone 2/3 of the time. Those average errors are based on the 67th percentile. Okay, so there are times, 1/3 of the time, where it doesn't even end up in the cone, which means the influences could be even farther away from the forecast track. Okay, so what I'm trying to get across here is the idea that, number one, forget about the line. And I think if the media was actually interested in serving people, they would get rid of it too, but I doubt that's going to happen. And then the other thing is that if you're on the edge of the fan, you could still have influences outside of the fan. And again, remember that it only ends up in the cone 2/3 of the time, which means the influences could be even farther outside of the fan than what a particular graphic is showing. So you just need to be really, really cautious here and not take anything literally. The observed errors that the Hurricane Center puts out, this is not a criticism of them. They produce this data because they want to be able to quantify the amount of uncertainty in a forecast. That's where our science is right now. We wish it was better, but it's not, okay? And so this is what we have to deal with. And so I would rather be, and I think they would too, rather be honest with you and tell you what the range of possibilities are than pretend to be confident and say, this is where it's going, and then have to backtrack on that, as they would almost have to do. All right, let me put myself back in the corner. That is bonus weather video number 1 for this week, a long-winded one. The next one will be coming up on Friday, and of course the next daily weather update will be coming up tomorrow. So you all take care, folks, and we'll talk to you soon.